Hello, welcome to our 4th episode of EnergyBin Insights, the webinar series that explores solutions for PV repair, resale, and recycling. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Melissa Schmid, and I'm the marketing manager here at EnergyBin. We are an online business community for solar professionals who are committed to accelerating a robust and sustainable secondary market. Our members collaborate via trade, networking, and educational activities like this webinar. These webinars are made possible by collaboration with industry professionals like yourselves. Join our EnergyBin community to help support these efforts to buy and sell solar equipment on our safe trading platform and to network with your industry peers. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel to access recordings for this episode and other EnergyBin Insights webinars. Today's presentation is all about how human behavior affects the decision regarding PV reuse and recycling. Our guest speaker, Julien Walzberg, will cover key findings from a recent study published by National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We'll learn how PV owners, installers, recyclers, and manufacturers choose to repair, reuse, recycle, landfill, or store aging PV modules under varying scenarios. Before we start, feel free to post questions as we go, and thanks to those who have submitted questions in advance. We'll have time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, I'll briefly share the slide deck and a link provided in the chat box in just a moment. Welcome, Julien. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I'm Julien Walzberg. I'm a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. And today I'm going to present you the work that I've been doing during my postdoc at NREL. That is titled Solar PV Reuse and Recycling, How Human Behavior Affects the Fate of Aging Solar Panels. So I will start with some background and then quickly present our circular economy agent-based model. Then we look at some of the results from this study. So we're going to look at what are the effects of techno-economic interventions and behavioral interventions on the fate of end-of-life PV modules. And finally, I will present you some of the lessons learned during this postdoc and this work with agent-based modeling for the circular economy. So just some background, you may be all aware that in the next decades, the demand for raw material is expected to increase. So if, for instance, for PV materials, that's about 3,000% between 2015 and 2060. So it's quite a lot of an increase. And right now we are consuming about 100 billion metric tons of materials each year, and that's projected to be about 177 by 2050. So that causes a lot of issues, and one of them being the increased risk posed by sudden supply restrictions of some of those precious or critical materials that some of some technologies such as PV may need, as well as contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions because materials have embodied energy and they also need to be transported. So a solution to those issues could be to apply circular economy principles that spur material efficiency, for instance, through reusing or recycling products. So there are 4 main broad strategies with sub-strategies in each of them. For applying for transitioning to a more circular economy. The first one being narrowing flows, so using less materials in the first place for a given functional unit or a given product, so to speak. The second broad strategy is to slow flows, so use those materials and products for longer. The third one is using regenerating flows, so for instance, using renewable energy or using biosource materials. And finally, cycling flows, so recycle or recover energy from materials at end of life. Regarding PV, the projected PV waste in the US in 2050 is between 7.5 and 10 million ton, according to a NREL IEA report from 2016. And the circular economy could help capture some of the value that's contained within this PV waste, at the same time lower demand for raw materials for those products. Of course, techno-economic solutions are going to be important and necessary to transition to a more circular PV industry, but they may not be sufficient. And I will explain why in just a moment. So transitioning to a circular economy may imply that we change the way that we produce and consume. So organizations may need to adopt new business models, for instance, to facilitate the sharing economy. And individuals may also need to adopt new behaviors, for instance, to recycle or reuse some products. So when we are interested into human behaviors and behavioral change, one of the first things we can do to understand those concepts better is to use recent advances in economics. So particularly Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, two recent Nobel Prize in economy. So those two economists found out that human behaviors are not necessarily rational. So we don't always make the best decision for ourselves. And that's also something that's valid for organizations as well. Those behaviors are also heterogeneous, so we don't all behave the same. They're constrained by our technological environment and our social norms. So a good example of a social norm is that when we go out in public, we all wear pants because that's a social norm, that's what we do. So we influence each other through those social norms. Some behaviors are expected of us. And finally, those behaviors evolve with time. So we don't behave the same way as our parents that didn't behave the same way as their parents and so on. So if we want to summarize those insights, we can say that the techno-economic potential of a technology or a behavior, such as a recycling behavior, may be different from its market potential because of all those constraints that I just mentioned, and because of the fact that we don't always make rational decisions as well. So now, how can we model behavior change? We started our project by conducting a literature review, looking at all the different type of methodologies that have been used to study the circular economy. So you can see that mostly methodologies from the industrial ecology field, such as life cycle assessment, material flow analysis, and input-output analysis have been used. But to a lesser extent, some methodologies from the complex system science field, such as system dynamics, agent-based modeling, discrete event simulation as well, have also been used to study the circular economy. Those methods have also been combined with each other, but mostly within their own field. So methods from industrial ecology together, methods from complex system science together as well. And what was interesting during this review is that we realized that agent-based modeling was quite a good methodology to represent decisions, and especially human decisions, as well as the influence of the decision of different actors with each other. So what is exactly agent-based modeling? It's a bottom-up form of modeling where we start with an agent. An agent can be anything from a molecule to a household to an individual. And those agents are going to make decisions during the simulation. So it's also a dynamic type of modeling. And they're going to those decisions are going to influence the agents with each other. So they're going to influence each other. Finally, those agents are also contained within an environment. So for instance, in our case, for our project, the environment was the US, and our agents were the different stakeholders of the PV industry. And the goal is to understand how the system's macro level behavior will emerge from the individual behaviors of the agents. And in our case, how we can transition from a more circular PV industry from all the decisions from the PV stakeholders. So the advantage of the ABM method is that we can model individual decisions and peer effects, as well as represent a population heterogeneity. In our case, population heterogeneity can simply be the installed capacity that can be different for different PV owners. So just two quick examples of agent-based modeling. The first one is a model that studied solar adoption, residential solar adoption. And you can see that they accounted for three factors that may affect the decision to adopt solar energy for households: the attitude toward that type of energy, the economics, and social, so again, peer influence. So I want to mention that model because we also accounted for those three factors in our own work. So I thought it would be interesting to just present that example. Another example here regarding management of e-waste. So that's another agent-based model. You can see the different agents there that are related through a social network. That's represented by a graph. And you can see that there are different decisions that were modeled in this agent-based modeling work. So the choice of storing e-waste, the choice of throwing it away in the trash, returning it, or try to sell it on secondary market. Again, I wanted to mention that example because we also have similar end-of-life option in our own work. So now really quickly, how do we define our agents' behavioral rules? How do we define how they're going to make decisions? Most of the time in agent-based modeling, we use social psychology studies that can help define how our agents are going to make decisions. But that's quite overwhelming when we start to look at the social psychology theories out there, because there are more than 83. So how do we choose one, right? Fortunately, some of them are more popular than others. So you can see here, some of them are more cited. So the size of the node is bigger. They're also related to more other theories that are out there. And you can see, so they're more central in this graph than other theories. One of them is the theory of planned behavior, quite central, quite cited, especially popular right now in the industrial ecology field and circular economy studies. You can see here the number of publications has increased in the past years. And this theory tried to explain human behaviors based on three main factors: the attitude toward the behavior. So for instance, someone that's more environmentally conscious may be more inclined to recycle than someone else. Subjective norms, again, that's the influence that our neighbors or friends or coworker or family may have on our own decisions. And finally, perceived behavioral control, which is simply the cost of the behavior. So in the theory, that can be the cognitive or financial cost. In our model, we just account for the financial cost of the different end-of-life pathways. So that's a framework that's quite flexible. So a lot of studies also add some variables to explain the behavioral adoption better. And so if we look at circular economy agent-based model, you can see that we have different, we try to represent different stakeholders. So manufacturers, recyclers, service providers, asset owners, regulators, and landfills. In the PV case, we only focus on those four there, so recyclers, service providers, asset owners, and manufacturers. But in other iteration of the CABM, we also added these two other type of agents. We applied the CABM to three case studies: PV, wind, and hard disk drives. And again, our goal was to try to represent those three different potential for material efficiency, so techno-economic as well as market potentials. And the primary research questions was, what are the technical, economic, and market conditions that will maximize value retention and minimize raw material inputs when applying different circular economy strategies to our different case studies? We have different inputs for the model. So for instance, recycling costs, the installed capacity for the assets, the distance to the different recycling sites, and we have different outputs that we are able to generate. So for instance, the number of years it may take to reach a specific threshold, such as a specific recycling rate, for instance, the share of the waste that end up in different end-of-life pathways, and so on. So, like I said, we represent different stakeholders by different agent types. We also have different flows of materials and product between those different agent types. So, for instance, the end-of-life PV models that end up being recycled are going to flow to the recyclers. The number of PV modules that are going to be landfilled are going to end up to the landfill agents. We are going to also represent a lifetime extension strategy, such as repair and reuse, also through the intermediary agent here, which is the service provider, so the installers in our case, for the PV case. The model is implemented in Python. We use two interesting libraries. One of them is helping us building agent-based model. The other one is helping us building the social networks that relates the agents with each other. And other than that, we're focusing on the US. We study the 2020 to 2050 period. So, so we try to project the number of waste and where this waste is going to flow in the future. And the time step is 1 year. So each year our PV owners are going to make decisions, for instance, regarding what they do with end-of-life PV module. So here are some of the details of the model. You can see that to generate the amount of end-of-life PV module, we are using a Webull function. So that's the equation right there. And to model two important decisions, the first one being what type of PV module the PV owner is going to purchase, so either a used PV module or a new one. And the second decision that we model is the end-of-life management decision, so where those different end-of-life PV modules are going to end up, so in landfill, to recycling, or maybe on secondary markets. We use the fear of ban behavior, so that's the equation right there. And you can see that's going to influence the amount of materials that end up in the different end-of-life pathways, so the different colors there. And that's a graph representing the amount of waste here for our wind case study. So another example is what are the different rules for the recycler agents. So first of all, recyclers may have a role of triage. So that's a behavior that we assess from interviews with some recyclers of PV. So the different PV module, the PV modules that end up at the recyclers may end up on secondary markets. So the recycler may assess that those PV modules are still functioning and can be sold on secondary market, or they can actually be recycled as well. The second behavior that we are representing in our model is the fact that those recyclers can learn. So there is a learning by doing effect. So the fact that the more end-of-life PV modules recyclers can get their hand on, the more they may be able to benefit from economies of scale and decrease the recycling costs, so decrease the recycling fee that they are charging the PV owners for recycling their end-of-life PV module. And you will see that that parameter is quite important as well when we're going to look at the results. Finally, another important aspect that we model through those recycler agents is the fact that we have different recycling processes that can yield different amounts of recovered materials. So some recycling processes, for instance, for the wind case, may only recover the glass fibers when we paralyzed end-of-life wind blades, for instance, while other recycling processes, such as mechanical recycling, may also get plastic as well as the resin fiber in those end-of-life wind blades. So that's exactly what I've just talked about, but for the PV case. So that's the details of the different end-of-life behavioral rules. Just for the installer, behavioral rules, they are going to collect the modules that may be refurbished, repaired, and sell them on secondary markets. And if the modules are too costly to repair, the installers are going to make a decision that's going to be this time purely based on cost and not on other factors such as attitude or subjective norms. They're going to make a decision to recycle or landfill those PV modules as well. And here we already looked at the recycler, but the manufacturers, it's pretty simple behavioral rule. The only thing that they're in charge of is computing the economic benefit from using recycled material rather than virgin material. So for instance, in the case of copper, copper scrap is about 90% of the price of virgin copper. And so we can compute the benefit of using recovered material that way. And we also, the other thing that we model through those manufacturers' agent is the fact that they generate industrial waste, so silicon curve. And again, we can look at interventions where we would minimize industrial waste as well. So we calibrated the model as best as we could with the data that were available. So except for the European Union, there is not really much information regarding the recycling rates in other countries. It was estimated to be about 10% in other countries than in Europe, but there is no specific data for the US. So we ended up using that data. We calibrated our model to have in the baseline scenario a low recycling rate, so around 10%. That's the green wage right here, as well as a low reuse rate, again with the data that we could find. A low reuse rate of about 1%, and that's the orange wedge right here. So you can see that most of the end-of-life PV modules in the baseline scenario end up being landfilled, as well as stored, but storing is only a temporary solution. So we modeled that in the ABM by the fact that the agents could only store end-of-life PV module for a limited period of time, so between 1 to 8 years. And after that, that period of time, they were forced to make a decision regarding those end-of-life PV module. Finally, we also made sure that the cumulative PV capacity, installed PV capacity, was agreeing with what was published in the literature, and especially the IRENA IEA report, so about 500 gigawatt for crystalline silicon PV modules, and also that we were computing a similar amount of waste. So about 9 million tons of PV materials in 2050. Some overview of our results. We looked at different interventions. So we had a baseline scenario, but then tried to modify some of the parameters in our model to model different interventions. So for instance, we model a landfill ban where agents were forced to recycle. They could not choose the landfill pathway. There's still a little bit of landfill happening because the landfill ban was assumed to happen to only start in 2020. So all the waste between 2000 and 2020 was going to landfill regardless of the ban. We also looked at another scenario, for instance, where we increased the lifetime of our PV module. So just with a simple regression model, increasing the lifetime from 30 years in 2020 to 60 years in 2050. You can see that that decreased the amount of waste overall. We looked at another scenario where we would have improved warranties for used PV modules. So in that way, we obtain a higher reuse rate and so on. We looked at other scenarios as well. I'm going to present some of them in more detail right now. One of the first questions we wanted to answer was what could be a good subsidy strategy to increase circularity for the PV industry. And one of the first kind of variable that we looked at was the recycling cost. And so what we did is varied the recycling cost from the baseline value to other values. The baseline value being $25 to $30 per module. So that was at the time, I think there are new data that just came out regarding recycling costs in the US, but that's what we had at the time. And where it's going to impact the decision of our PV owners, it's going to be in the perceived behavioral control factor here. So in other words, the cost of the behavior. So that's going to decrease the cost of the recycling behavior relatively to the landfill and the other end of life option cost. So that's quite a complicated figure here, but the main message I want you to retain there is that because we have a model that can account for social factors, we wanted to look at different cases where we would assume that the PV owner's decisions regarding the adopted end-of-life pathway was only depending on cost or also depending on social factors. And you can see that if the decision is purely based on cost, there is no recycling happening unless the recycling cost is below the landfill cost. So that makes sense. If landfill is cheaper than recycling and the decision is only based on cost, the PV owner agent are always going to choose to landfill the PV model unless it's cheaper. But if we account for social factors such as the attitude and the subjective norms that I mentioned earlier, we can see that the recycling rate increase with decreasing recycling cost. So a little bit faster at first and then reaching a plateau at the end, so kind of slowing down toward the end. And again, that's an interesting result, and that show that if our PV owners are more environmentally conscious and they account for other factors in the decision, and they don't mind if it's a little bit more expensive to recycle, but they still think it's the right thing to do. So in that case, we would have a little bit more recycling, and as the recycling costs decrease, we would increase the recycling as well. And that makes sense because a lot of studies have found that PV owners are actually more environmentally conscious than other type of consumers. So another results that we found is that a good strategy could be to take advantage of the learning effects of the learning by doing for the recyclers and provide high subsidies for recyclers for a short amount of time. If we were to do that, we may trigger a virtuous cycle where, because we subsidize the recyclers, we may be able to decrease the fee that they charge the PV owner. So more PV owners may be willing to recycle the end-of-life PV module. And doing so, recyclers get their hand on more end-of-life PV module, may be able to take advantage of economies of scale more. And so they may be able to decrease the recycling cost even more. And maybe at the end of the day, end up not even needing the subsidies and have profitable recycling processes. That would encourage even more PV owner to recycle and so on and so forth. So that could be an interesting intervention there. Of course, we would have to be careful that when the subsidies stop, we don't have recycling costs that increase again and discourage PV owner to recyclers when the subsidies stop. Some other scenarios that we looked at are different recycling processes. So you can see that in the baseline recycling process, silver and silicon metals are not recycled, but we look at two other recycling processes, the recovery end-of-life photovoltaic process, a process that's been published in the literature that actually recover silver metal and silicon metal, as well as a higher fraction of the other materials contained in PV, and the Arizona State University process that also recover silver and silicon. And so what was interesting there is that in the case of the FRED process, the recycling cost was cheaper, so about $16 per module. And we also recovered 20% more materials per module than in the baseline scenario. So we obtain a higher recycling rate because it's cheaper for PV owners. So they choose the recycling pathway more. And because we also recover more material, we end up with 8 times more recovered materials than in the baseline. And we also greatly increased the recyclers' net income in 2050 to about $2 billion. The ASU process, on the other hand, was too costly. It's too costly to drive recycling behavior. It's not mature enough yet. It's about $36 per module, estimated to be about $36 per module. So that discourage PV owner to recycle, and we actually we don't get any recycling in our simulation. So what we looked as well is what would be the effect of having lower recycling cost as well as a higher material recovery fraction. And what is interesting in this figure is that it seems to suggest that it could be more interesting to try to decrease recycling costs. So for instance, by improving economies of scale, having more volume getting towards recyclers, PV recyclers at the beginning, than trying to necessarily improve the total material recovery fraction for the recyclers. Because you can see that here the lines are mainly vertical, so we would get more value by first trying to decrease the cost of recycling, and then trying to increase the fraction of the different materials that are being recovered. Another intervention that we looked at was assuming that we would have warranties for used PV module. So we found a study that mentioned that for remanufactured product, having better warranties could improve the attitude of the consumers regarding those type of product. And so they may end up having a similar attitude that they have with new products. So in other words, attitude would not be a deciding factor anymore regarding those regarding used products. And so that's what we assumed in our model. Instead of having a low attitude for used PV module of 0.35, we assumed an attitude of 0.5, which was the same as for new PV modules. And by doing so, we increased the reuse rate from about 1% to 23%. But we also decreased the recycling rates from about 8% to 1%. Because those different circular strategies are competing with each other. And so whatever end-of-life PV modules that end up being reused are not and do not end up being recycled, at least for the first life cycle. In the second life cycle, of course, they also need to be managed. But in our simulation, what they ended up, they all ended up in landfill rather than being recycled. So that was kind of a missed opportunity that we identified there. And even in an ideal case when we removed all constraints regarding reuse, the only constraint we kept was the fact that PV modules could only be reused once, so they only had 2 life cycles. We can only provide 1/3 of the demand for PV. So that allied that even if we had an ideal reuse case, we could not even supply all the demand. So that's another limitation there. And in 2050, the waste from second life PV module represented about 11% of the total waste. So that again, that shows that recycling is crucial because we need to do something with this waste since it cannot be reused again. We looked at another scenario where we would be seeding used PV module, for instance, to undeserved communities. That's a strategy that has been explored by other studies for distributed PV, so for new PV module. And we thought it would be interesting to look at the case for used PV as well. And doing so, we increased the reuse rate to about 7% from our baseline. We also conducted a sensitivity analysis. So by building a machine learning meta model, because agent-based modeling is quite, takes a lot of time to compute. The computation is quite long, so it's about 2 minutes per simulation. When we use a machine learning meta model, it's a matter of, it's less than a second. So we can conduct way more simulations by using a meta model that we trained with output from the agent-based model. And that's what we did. And we were able to identify that the recycling cost was the most influential parameter regarding the recycling rate, followed by the landfill cost, then the learning effect, then the attitude towards used module. But if we were to look at the reuse rate rather than the recycling rate, the attitude towards used module become the most influential parameter, followed by other parameters as well. And still using the machine learning meta model, we were also able to look at the effect of combining different interventions. So for instance, decreasing the recycling cost, but increasing the landfill cost, decreasing the recycling cost and increasing the attitude toward used PV module, and so on. We also looked at the learning effect and the recycling cost. And you can see that some combination are synergic, so they enhance each other. Some are more synergic than others, and some are not synergic at all. So for instance, here, because reuse and recycling compete, we can see that there's not really any synergy here when we try to decrease recycling costs and increase reuse for increasing the attitude toward use PV. So some of the lessons that we learned, first of all, we compared in our paper, we compared our results with the literature. Most of our results were agreeing with what other researchers have found. Some interesting results are that circularity strategies compete, that the learning effect is quite an important parameter to be accounting for. Some results differ too from what others have found. So for instance, Deng and her co-worker found that landfill cost was the most influential parameter to improve recycling. And we found that it was only the second most influential parameter in our case, and the recycling costs were more influential. So that can be explained by, of course, having different models, the fact that we focused only on the US and other reasons. So some of the benefits from agent-based modeling, we can model stakeholders' decisions, and those decisions would lead to the adoption of different circular economy strategies. And some other advantages that I haven't shown here in the PV case because there was only the first iteration of our CABM, is that we can also keep track of variables at agent level in addition to the system level. And we can assign, so we can know the recycling, the amount of recycling PV from each individual agent, as well as having the total amount for the US. And we can assign individual characteristics to the agent. So for instance, here in the wind agent-based model, we're able to represent each wind turbine project, wind plant projects in the US, as well as representing all the landfill sites in the US and all the recycling sites for end-of-life wind blades. And that was very interesting for us because we could improve the accuracy of our transportation model as compared to our other case study or previous case studies. And you can see that, you can see here in the figure the different routes from this particular wind plant project to all the different landfills and all the different recycling sites. And by doing so, like I said, we can better compute transportation costs. That, of course, is going to influence the recycling and landfilling decisions. Some of the drawback of the ABM method is that we need to combine it with other methods to provide information on environmental impacts. So for instance, life cycle assessment. Like I said, it's computationally expensive, but we can use machine learning to alleviate that issue. And then we can also, of course, like with any type of modeling, there are some uncertainties. It may be difficult to calibrate the model with available data. But what's interesting though is that most agent-based models are stochastic. So we use probability distribution to represent the heterogeneity of the agent, for instance. And since we do that, we can easily conduct some Monte Carlo analysis in order to assess the uncertainty of our model. So some key takeaways: agent-based modeling is a suitable tool to study the circular economy. It models the interaction between different actors in our complex social technical systems. The developed C agent-based model has been calibrated to the current situation, reproduce projected cumulative installed capacity and waste generation from the literature. We can look at different interventions belonging to techno-economic or social factors and behavioral factors. And we can use machine learning to expose the model behavior more broadly. And so if you're interested into learning more about this research, we published a number of papers, so 2 journal publications, as well as a few conference proceedings. And we have some upcoming publications for 2 other case studies, so the artist drive case study, as well as end-of-life wind blades case study. And we have a summary paper that we are writing right now. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, just let me know.
Thank you, Julien. This was a lot of information. I'm sure everyone is just trying to comprehend it all. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. It's well appreciated. Let's get into the questions of this presentation. One question I have right off the bat is, you mentioned machine learning for enhancing the accuracy of the ABM modeling. What else can be done in future years to further enhance this model for accuracy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, what we start seeing in the agent-based modeling community is to sort of trying to go away from theories such as social psychology theories, such as the theory of planned behavior, and really try to build models that are data-driven. So instead of coming up with behavioral rules for the agents that are coming from theories and other models that are out there, we would just use the data that we can access, and the agents would learn their own behaviors based on this data. So that's kind of the 2 ways that machine learning can be used. The first way is how we use it in this project, which is to conduct sensitivity analysis and explore the model more broadly. The second way is to actually have the agents learn their own behaviors. And that's even more exciting, in my opinion. And I think the agent-based modeling community is also excited to go along that path. And that would improve accuracy if we have the data to, again, it's always a question of data. If we have the data to train the agents, that would, of course, improve accuracy of the model.
Data is king these days, as they say.
Yeah.
Is NREL considering an initiative, or has begun an initiative, to track and plot all of the PV recycling facilities and landfills as you did for the wind sector at all? I'm referring to slide 32 in your presentation.
Yeah, another good question. So for wind, we were able to sort of track all the recyclers because there are not that many. There are actually less than for PV. Even if for PV, it's also, for instance, less than for electronic recyclers. But so that was in a way easier. For PV, we want to do that. So there is a senior researcher at NREL, Garvin Heath, that I think really want to conduct this sort of study, but I don't, at the moment, I'm not sure we actually have a project going on, but that's what we would like to do. So in the PV model, what we used is a slide from the Solar Energy Industry Association that mentioned about 16 recycling facilities, but we know there are more than 16 out there, but that's what we ended up using in this particular project. Because we knew that where there were two, it was a map with all the recycling facilities. But we would like to, but I don't know if it's going on and if it's gonna be done in the short term.
Well, we'll all stay posted for that. In the meantime, I have heard of another initiative, thanks to Amanda Bybee, another EnergyBin member like NREL. She and a group of colleagues published a new website called Solarrecycleorg and maps out recycling facilities that they have interviewed and pre-qualified across the United States. The link is in the chat box for all of you. Next question, Julien, is how much damage is too much for repair or for recycling? And also, I'll just add as an example, what if the glass is shattered? What should the individual do with a shattered glass module?
Yes, that's something that we had to simplify our model because we have a lot of different components in it. So what we assume in our model is whenever a PV module is reused, it has a shorter lifetime, so 20 years average lifetime instead of 30 years. And it has also a higher chance of failure, of early failure. So we change the alpha parameter in the Weibull function for the reused module. But other than that, we didn't account for, we didn't have a more precise modeling for the end-of-life PV module. However, I would mention another NREL model that's called PDIs. That's been published now as well, or is going to be published soon. And they have much more details in the type of PV modules in the model. So they have different vintage of PV, and they also model better those type of failure that you mentioned.
Oh, great. And if individuals want to get in touch with you for that research piece, then you'll be available to provide it for them, correct?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Excellent. Back to this research study, let's go back to that strategy of reuse. What did your research show in terms of reusing modules as a circular economy strategy? How viable is it? And really, what needs to happen in order for a second life of modules to be fully appreciated?
Again, a very interesting question because it's kind of a trendy topic. At least it was maybe a year ago. In the circular economy field is to understand if circular economy strategies are actually providing sustainability benefits. So the whole relationship between sustainability and circularity has been questioned in recent CE literature. And of course, so a lot of authors are of course saying that we should always, if we can, we always should try to assess the environmental impact of different strategies, for instance, with life cycle assessment. But in the case of PV, at least from what I know and the few research that has been done regarding reuse, it seems to show that it's better to be reusing a PV module than recycling. Even if you have a module that has that's a little bit less efficient than a brand new PV module, it still saves some environmental impacts as compared to when you have to build a brand new module. So on an environmental point of view, of course, I would say it's very important to be reusing PV, even before trying to recycle it. And like I already told you, Melissa, but one of your article comparing the PV secondary market to the used market for car, I think that's a great comparison, and I would hope that we can get to that point where the secondary market for PV is as strong as the secondary market for car, because that would make sense. There's not really any any reason why not. And we've of course, I mean, there are some reasons, so such as safety concerns and things like that. But if we have the warranties, if we have the certification, if we have all of those in place, there are really no reason why we shouldn't be reusing PV modules.
Yes, and of course, I agree with you. Safety and performance need to be in place, and there needs to be, in order for there to be a resale value for those secondhand goods. And although EnergyBin sees on our trading exchange probably 90 to 95% new with warranty equipment for resale, equipment that has fallen out of the traditional distribution channel, we still see that remainder of used equipment, and it has been as young as 6 months old. So not all used equipment is outdated technology either, and there needs to be an alternative, because for a 6-month-old high efficiency module to go to a recycling facility just doesn't really make sense, as an example. Okay, last question, and we're coming up on our time. How does a society's culture affect the decision to recycle or reuse? And also, what about an organization's culture?
Yeah, so there's it's interesting you mentioned culture, because there's an interesting paper that was published by Benjamin Sovacool in a year ago or something. I can't remember the exact title, but it was published in Nature Energy, and it was really looking at the whole relationship between culture and energy technologies. So, sorry, and
yeah, keep going.
My point, yeah, I kind of lost my thought process, but yeah, so he showed that. For instance, if you take the sharing economy, and if you look at apps such as Uber or Lyft and all those car sharing apps and car sharing business model, in some countries it may not work and it may fail because the ownership of a car is still valued in the culture, and in some culture it may actually end up being a business model that's adopted and that's pretty successful. So that shows you that culture is quite important. In our work, we didn't really incorporate all aspects of the culture of an organization or the culture of a population, but the attitude factor within the theory of planned behavior can be seen as a proxy to at least some part of the culture of an organization or some part of the culture of a population. What I mean by that is that if you have a population or an organization that is more environmentally conscious, they will have a better attitude towards certain behaviors than others. So especially towards recycling, for instance. So
sounds like, go ahead.
Yeah, that shows that, and of course it's distributed among your population and among your organization. But what needs to happen, and what I think is happening in some countries and some regions, is that the overall population or the overall organization are going towards being more environmentally conscious and towards favoring more of those green behaviors than other behaviors.
It sounds like you have your hypothesis for your next research study, Julien.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We've come to the end of our time today. Thank you, Julien, for sharing about your knowledge regarding psychology and sociology behind PV reuse and recycling. To learn more about the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, you can visit their website. That's NREL.gov. That's NREL.gov. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. Subscribe to our newsletter to get notifications for upcoming webinars. We'll send out the recording after we end the show today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.